So, this video is hard to explain, but what you're looking at right now is called a bucket. Doesn't look very interesting, and it doesn't look like there's much to say about it. Well, for some reason I've spent a ridiculously long time studying these things, and I've developed so much complicated theory about them and how they move, you wouldn't believe it. So, if that doesn't sound like your cup of tea, then I would perfectly understand. But unfortunately, I'm too deep into this to turn back now, so here goes nothing. To be clear, these buckets are just a small part of a kind of obscure puzzle game that, let's face it, you're probably never going to play. And even if you do play it, none of what I say in this video will help you at all with any of the puzzles in the game. Like, this video is entirely useless. I'm just going to look at one pretty basic little guy who really doesn't matter much in the game he's in, let alone anything outside of this video. But I suppose I should start off by explaining what on earth even is a bucket. Well, they're pretty simple. They'll wait there doing nothing until something pushes them. Then each turn, they'll do one of two things. They'll either take a step forwards if they can, or if they can't take a step forwards, then they'll turn around. Also, they're not very smart, so if they come up to some water, then they'll just walk into it. And once they've fallen in, they're lost for good. So, why are they called buckets? Well, they can't hold water, but they can pick up beans. The game's called Bean and Nothingness, and these beans are kind of important in the actual game, but we're going to ignore that entirely. Just know that the buckets can pick up beans, and if you shoot them with your magic wand, then they'll drop the beans. And that's it. I can't stress this enough, these are not fascinating machines or anything. They literally just walk back and forth. And once they start moving, there's no way to stop them. You can't push them, you can't make them rotate 90 degrees or anything. They'll just keep walking back and forth on the same row forever. Unless they drown. But I wouldn't have made this video unless there was at least something interesting about them. So, where do we even begin? Well, for one, they can move into a space that something else is moving out of. So they can follow directly behind other buckets, and that also works at corners. So for example, you can make a loop of buckets that can all still shift around a bit. Each one moves into the space the one in front used to be in. Or here's another example. It might look like absolute chaos, but it might make more sense if I put some guidelines up. Each bucket is just moving forwards and backwards along the loop, so the whole thing shifts clockwise, then turns around, and then shifts anti-clockwise. Here's one final example of a shifting pattern. It kind of looks like an opening and closing eye. And you might have noticed that it looks like we have 4 moving blocks that somehow shift around each other to open up a space in the middle. But that's not how I originally designed it. I was actually trying to create a spiral. And just like before, each bucket moves inwards along the spiral, then turns around, and then moves outwards. So hopefully you can begin to understand why I'm making this video. And trust me, I've got a lot more cooler stuff later down the line. But the other weird thing about their movement is that a bucket can't move into a space if another bucket is also trying to move into that space. So these two buckets kind of bounce off the air. Which sort of makes sense because they can't both move into the same space, and so neither of them can. But it looks weird. You can even stand between them and it won't affect anything. In fact, it even works if two buckets are trying to walk into the same bit of water. They still bounce off each other. That's not really going to be important, but there you go, kind of weird. You can also use one bucket to hold back two buckets. These two can't move forwards because they're both looking at the same space. And so this one can't move forwards because the one in front won't move out the way. These kind of situations can be pretty hard to work out what happens. The movement of one bucket can depend on the movement of all the buckets in front of it. You, the player, always have priority over other buckets though. So if you and a bucket try and move into the same space, then you'll win. So here's a super weird example. This shifting square from earlier is impenetrable. You can't push buckets once they're already moving, there are no gaps for you to enter. But you can stop the buckets from moving by trying to walk into them. Because this bucket can't move downwards if you're also trying to walk into that place. But then the bucket behind that bucket can't move forwards, and the bucket behind that one can't move forwards, all the way around until the bucket that you were walking into also can't move forwards, so you can't move forwards either. Weird. Okay, so now you know what a bucket is and what it does. But why would you care? Honestly, I played this entire game without thinking too much about them. But let me show you a custom community puzzle called Bounce House. This is one of the earliest custom puzzles by a user called Daniel. and there's a switch on the floor that you need to keep pressing to open the doors to get to the exits. So you can make a bucket press the switch for you, but then it will just walk into the water. You could make the bucket bounce between other buckets, but then those buckets get pushed and eventually all your buckets just fall into the water. This is a pretty difficult puzzle. You might want to see if you can figure out what the solution will look like. The trick is to make a bucket square, where each bucket bounces off another bucket at the corner. Once you've set it up, it will keep bouncing back and forth forever, or at least until something bumps into it. This isn't very complicated yet, but already it's kind of interesting. The buckets are more powerful than the sum of their parts. So what else can we do? Well, you might notice that we can make this square as big as we like. As long as each side is the same length, then each bucket takes the same amount of time. If they weren't the same length, it would break apart. But we don't have to stop at squares. We could make a rectangle. Or an L shape. Each bucket still has the same distance it has to walk. Okay, that's cool. But what's the smallest shape we can make? Well, we can actually make a bucket square where each bucket is stuck on one tile. And each turn, every bucket turns around. And what's super weird is that we can't even get inside anymore. You can't push the buckets once they're already moving, and you can't disrupt anything, so it's stuck like that. And there's one more cool thing I want to point out about bucket squares before we move on. So, notice that the square is symmetrical around each corner. Or in other words, both diagonals are lines of symmetry. This means that if one bucket is walking into a corner, then another mirror bucket is also walking into the corner. So they bounce off each other, it's symmetrical. But this means that you can have more than one bucket along each side, as long as it all remains symmetrical. You don't need to know exactly what each side is doing, you can just rely on the symmetry, because whenever one bucket walks into a corner, the mirror bucket also walks into the corner, every time. And I really hope you're a fan of symmetry, because we're going to be talking about it a lot later on. Normal symmetry, rotational symmetry, it's going to get wild. But for now, let's go back to looking at just two buckets walking into each other. Because you might have noticed that one of two things can happen. Either they'll come face to face with each other and then collide, or they'll collide with an air tile between them. That's a bit annoying to remember, but sure. The strange thing is, if you have two buckets that have an air collision, then even if you get in their way and disrupt them, they'll always have an air collision. You can't get them to have a face-to-face collision anymore. And similarly, if two buckets have a face-to-face collision, you can't make them have an air collision. And that's kind of weird. Why is that? Well, this might seem like a bit of a stretch, but let's have a look at chess. So, if you haven't played chess, there are these pieces called bishops, and bishops can only move diagonally. So if they start on a light square, then they can only ever move to other light squares. You'd call it a light squared bishop, and similarly for dark squared bishops. So if two bishops start on opposite colours, then they can get face to face with each other. Whereas, if two bishops start on the same colour squares, then they can never get face to face with each other. Do you see where I'm going with this? Except, obviously, this doesn't work with buckets because they don't move diagonally, so that was useless. But you can still kind of see the light and dark squares on the grid, and the two buckets start on the same colour square. Then they move, and they're still on the same colour square as each other. They're always on the same colour square as each other. And it's the same thing if they start on the opposite colour squares to each other. So we can't call them dark squared buckets and light squared buckets anymore, because they keep changing. But we can say that they're always the opposite. So let's say that they're the opposite polarity to each other. And polarity is the word I'm going to use because it sounds cool. And to show that they're different, I'll mark one with a plus symbol and one with a minus symbol. Just to show that they're the opposite. But I could have chosen any two symbols, and it doesn't matter which way round they are, just that they're the opposite to each other. Remember, I'm making this up as I go along. Except, sadly, this doesn't work. If they're moving together, then it's fine. These two buckets are on the same colour tiles as each other, so they're the same polarity. But what if one of them turns around? That's ruined everything, hasn't it? One of them's changed colours, but the other one hasn't. So maybe this same colour or opposite colour thing doesn't work. Well, there's an easy fix to this. We can just label the bucket by saying it's going to be the same polarity if it's moving to the right, but the opposite polarity if it's moving to the left. So we put a plus on the right side and a minus on the left side. And obviously we can do the same thing with the other bucket. So when we compare the two of them, we're comparing the symbols at the front of each bucket. If the symbols are the same, then they're on the same colour tiles. If the symbols are the opposite, then they're on opposite colour tiles. It's just a neat way of notating it. They're like bishops that change their mind when they hit a wall. And these plus and minus symbols kind of remind me of batteries, so I'm going to use batteries from now on as our polarity symbol. To figure out which way round the battery is, just compare it to another battery. But why bother? It's already easy to see whether they're on the same colour or not. Well, the important thing is, these symbols never change. It doesn't matter what path they take or how many times they turn around or anything. You only need to calculate polarity symbols once, and they'll stay the same forever. So, if they have the same symbol facing towards each other, then they'll always have an air collision, because they're coming at each other on the same colour tiles. Whereas if they have the opposite symbols facing towards each other, then they'll have a face-to-face collision. Does that make any sense? Remember, all I'm really doing is comparing whether they're on the same colour tiles or not, but also taking their direction into account. That's all the battery symbols mean. And so we've come up with a notion of bucket polarity. If batteries of two buckets are pointing in the same direction, then we can say they're the same polarity, whereas if they're flipped the other way, then they're the opposite polarity. And to remember what happens when buckets collide, you can use opposites attract and likes repel. I really hope that using batteries doesn't seriously date this video. Like, everyone knows batteries are supposed to face in the same direction, right? If you want to set up buckets to have a certain collision, then you just need to make sure you start them off with the right polarity. After that, you can push them around to get them into the right place. Okay, that was a bit of a step up from what we were looking at before, but if you've got this far, then the good news is you'll probably be able to make it through the whole video. All we're doing is looking for patterns that aren't immediately obvious. But let's take a bit of a break from polarity. We'll come back to it later and see why it's useful, but first I have to admit something. You see, there are other monsters in this game that can cause things to go wrong. The first is called the Ice Monster. It freezes anything that comes too close, but who really cares? Obviously, if a bucket is frozen, then it's not going to move like other buckets. It's basically dead. I'm going to go off on a bit of a tangent here, but you can freeze buckets in funny positions. Like, you can freeze them as they duck to let you shoot over the top of them, so you get a squashed bucket, or freeze them as they're dropping a bean so it looks like they're glowing. And the second monster that can cause things to go wrong is called an Ikinger Kuroyama creature, otherwise known as an EKC. These things will grab a bucket if it walks on top of it, but can release it later on. So technically you can flip a bucket's polarity if you hold it still for a turn, because all the other buckets will have moved onto the opposite colour. But that's kind of annoying and it doesn't happen often, so let's just assume from now on that we're not dealing with any of these. Okay, let's look at something else. I want to have a closer look at groups of buckets. So buckets that are all following each other in a line. To make one, you can push multiple buckets at once that are all next to each other. If they collide with a wall, then they all turn around at once. So they basically just move like they're one long bucket. Can we do something with this? Well, if we go back to the bucket squares we had earlier, we can extend the sides by turning some of the buckets into groups. We're basically just stretching the shape sideways. We can even extend the minimal bucket square we had earlier. Just make each side into a group. Then just like before, it becomes impossible to get inside the bucket square. And even more excitingly, this lets us set up whatever system of buckets we want on the inside. So theoretically you can create whatever bucket system you want, even if you're surrounded by water. And when I say bucket system, I just mean any arrangement of moving buckets. I just think the phrase bucket system sounds pretty cool. And so now is a good time to point out what I'm working with here. There's the main game, obviously, which just has puzzles for you to do, but there's also an editor mode to build your own worlds. You can place down buckets, but unfortunately, you can't push them from within the editor, which means that every moving bucket in any of these examples needs to be pushed by hands, or I push a bucket into another bucket or something. So that can make it pretty difficult to set up examples, as you might imagine. Which is why I'm using these doors. I can open and close the doors while I'm working on a bucket system to stop everything going wrong. But back to groups. They might look like they're just a solid block, but it's possible to break them up by moving into them from the sides. And remember, you can only move into a group if the buckets in front are moving out of the way. Then you move into the place that bucket was, and the next bucket along bounces off you. That's where you can split it up into two smaller groups. Interestingly, once a bucket is separated from a group, there's no way to make it rejoin the group again. A bucket would need to walk into a space behind another bucket, but that's only possible if they're already part of the same group. Or a bucket would have to move forward while the other turns around, which also isn't possible. You can still make a group longer though, by pushing stationary buckets at the right time, although it can be a little tricky. So here's a question. What's going to happen if I completely separate this group? So I'm going to come in and break up all the buckets. And you might think that it would depend on the order I do it in, or exactly how I do it. But actually, you can work out what will happen using polarity. So to recap, if buckets are on the same colour tiles, then they have the same polarity, and if they're on opposite colour tiles, then they have the opposite polarity. That looks pretty horrible, but remember these groups are unstable. As soon as you break them, there's no way to get the batteries close to each other again. Because two buckets with opposite polarity will always have an air collision, which means there's always at least one empty space between them. So if we separate all these buckets, then there's only one place they can go. They have to spread out like this. And that's kind of cool. We can work out what will happen using polarity. If there was less space, then we wouldn't be able to completely separate the group. So what do we do if instead we want all the buckets to be the same polarity? Do we have to push them all individually? No, actually, there's an easy way to set that up too. If you push a stationary bucket, then it moves once that same turn, which might also push other buckets along. But weirdly, it's different if a bucket pushes a stationary bucket, because the new bucket looks like it starts moving, but it doesn't actually take a step forwards yet. And this makes it really easy to remember the polarity, because the polarity of the new bucket will be the same as the first bucket. In other words, the batteries point in the same direction. So you can push a bucket into a row of stationary buckets, and they'll all end up with the same polarity. This trick has saved me a lot of time. If all the buckets are the same polarity, then any collisions between these buckets will always be face-to-face collisions, and you won't end up with any groups. But there is the possibility that buckets from two different directions try to push a stationary bucket at the same time, in which case the game just has a priority order for which bucket gets to go first. So the top bucket pushes first, then the right one, then left one, then the bottom one. You don't need to remember that, obviously. Although, your push always gets priority over other buckets, so it's possible that a group can be broken on the same turn that it's created, which I think is weird, but honestly I can't even tell. And personally, I think it's kind of a shame that your bucket system might break if you rotate it 90 degrees. I'd rather it was just a special case where the bucket didn't move if more than one bucket were pushing it, but there you go. It hardly ever happens anyway. So hopefully you're beginning to appreciate why polarity, represented by our battery symbols, is a neat idea. But there's one more thing I haven't mentioned yet. What about buckets travelling vertically? And that might seem like it's going to make things harder, but it's actually pretty easy. Like, these three buckets are about to have an air collision, and we can draw in the batteries for the two horizontal ones, so what do you think the symbol for the third one should be? Well, pretty obviously, it's a plus sign on the bottom and a minus sign on the top. Our system still works. Working out what symbol to use is exactly the same as earlier. If two buckets are on the same colour tiles, then put the same signs in front of them. If they're on opposite colour tiles, then put opposite signs in front of them. And the cool thing is, this works with horizontal and vertical buckets. So here we have a horizontal bucket and a vertical bucket. Well, the only way they can collide is if they have an air collision. So they both try and move into the same space at the same time. And we can check if this is possible or not by looking at what signs they have pointing towards the centre. If it's the same sign, then they might collide, but if they have different signs, then they definitely won't collide, because one will be on dark squares while the other one is on light squares. That's going to be useful to remember. Let's have another look at the bucket squares from earlier. We can draw on the directional polarity of each bucket, and you can see that the buckets collide at their plus signs, and then collide at their minus signs. This is true no matter how big the bucket square is. In order to see the pattern more clearly, you can create multiple tessellating bucket squares. We can label all the corners either red or white, so that the collisions occur at red corners and then at white corners. And you can extend this pattern as much as you like in each direction. Okay, so how about another example? Let's look at what happens when two buckets are bouncing around a small space. Well, if they start at the sides, then either they'll start off with the same signs pointing towards the centre, in which case they're stuck, or they'll start off with opposite signs pointing towards the centre, in which case they will pass each other. Now they're both on the other side, but they still have opposite signs pointing towards the centre, so they'll still be able to pass each other again. And this will keep going back and forth. One bucket is the leader, and the other bucket follows, then the centre is empty, and then it repeats. At any point you can step into the middle to trap the buckets at the side. If you trap them like this, then their signs are still the opposite, so they'll still be able to pass each other when you let them go. but they might swap round who's the leader and who's the follower. But if you trap them in the bottom left corner, then all of a sudden they have the same signs pointing towards the centre, so they're now stuck there. They can't move and there's nothing you can do about it. It's the same if you trap them in the top right. So this system is collapsible to two irreversible states, and that's kind of weird. So hopefully you can see why these battery symbols help us understand and predict how everything works. And I should point out that we can also compare two buckets that are both travelling horizontally but in different rows. It's exactly the same thing as earlier. And if you're wondering why we would want to compare these two buckets if they're never going to collide, it's because one of them might collide with a vertical bucket, and the vertical bucket might collide with the other bucket, so we still want everything to be consistent. That was quite a lot to take in at once, so let's have a look at what we can do with directional polarity. In fact, now's a good time to mention that a lot of the reason why I've developed all this theory about buckets is because of the custom puzzles. The main game doesn't really use any advanced bucket theory, but you can play user-created puzzles either through the Steam Workshop or by sharing files over Discord, and that's when I started to encounter this stuff. So thanks to Nico and Zill for some great bucket puzzles, but in particular thanks to Vesuvius, who in my opinion makes the best custom puzzles I have ever seen. You can pretty much thank him for this entire video. By the way, this game released in 2021, but it's seen a bit more popularity recently after Patricia Taxon made a video about it. That's how I originally heard about it. And you can watch her video for a more general overview of the game if you want. But it's meant there's been a new community of players that have come to the game, and the Discord is pretty active, so if you want to try getting involved and making a puzzle for yourself, then there'll be people who'll be eager to play it. But anyway, thanks to Vesuvius for this next design. I'm calling it a Polarity Gate. Two buckets have an air collision every other turn. You can still pass between them without disrupting anything, remember, because you have movement priority over buckets. But those air collisions prevent other buckets of a certain polarity from passing through the gate. So for example, this one prevents approaching plus signs from passing through. You can't push them through or anything, they're just permanently stuck this side of the gate. But approaching minus signs can waltz right through as if nothing's there. But the strange thing is, once a bucket has passed through a polarity gate, it's now stuck on that side, because from the other direction it'll be approaching with a plus sign. Weird. You could also create two polarity gates next to each other, with the second one checking for the opposite sign as the first one. Now you can still walk through, obviously, but buckets can't pass through in either direction. Or as a final example, you could set up two polarity gates with opposite signs, but with a gap in between. Now if you send a bucket that can get past the first polarity gate, it will get stuck in the middle, and now you can't get through. You can't push the buckets, remember, so you're now stuck on this side. You've created a lockable door. And maybe that's not very exciting. There are other ways to create lockable doors, but this one is kind of a neat design. But before we can move on, there's something I should mention. So normally if two orthogonal buckets are approaching each other with opposite signs, then they'll move past each other. But that's only true if the first bucket can get out of the way. If it has to turn around, say if it collides with a wall, then the second bucket will bounce off it. This is why one bucket can stop two buckets, even if the two buckets are the opposite polarity to each other. So that's just one of those annoying things to keep in mind. And with that out the way, it's time to talk about perhaps my favourite thing you can do with buckets, called Interlacing, named after a level by Nico. So if you remember from earlier, we had an example where two buckets were moving past each other, but never colliding. This is the most basic example of interlacing. And there are two helpful things to keep in mind. First of all, it will be helpful to make sure they have opposite signs so they can pass each other. And second, we'll want to make sure they're walking the same distance, otherwise they could end up out of sync, their signs will match up, and they'll end up colliding. Now, this definitely isn't the only way to make interlacing buckets, but it's the easiest. We'll talk more about the more interesting ways to interlace much later, but for now, let's just use buckets with opposite polarity that walk the same distance. And it's worth going over what I mean when I'm talking about the distance that each of them has to walk, because what I'm really referring to is the period of each bucket, which is the number of turns it takes for a bucket to get back into the same position and the same direction it started in. So both of these buckets have a period of 10 turns. Well, actually we'll instead talk about the period of a system of buckets as a whole, which is the number of turns it takes for every bucket to end up in the same position and the same direction it started in at the same time. For example, this system has a period of 12, and you can count that if you want to. But does every system end up back where it started? Well, not necessarily. For example, in this system, one bucket breaks up a group of buckets. But it's impossible to get the group back together again, so we can never end up back how we started. However, there are only so many positions each bucket could be in, so eventually we'll have to repeat a pattern of buckets we had before. And once that happens, everything will play out the same way it played out last time, and we'll end up repeating ourselves again in an infinite loop. So, if a system of buckets will end up back where it started, let's say it's a stable system. And if it will never end up back where it started, then it's an unstable system. But every unstable system will eventually become a stable system, but everything just repeats from then on. So we can talk about the period of a stable system, meaning the number of turns it takes before it repeats itself again. And just for fun, I'll point out that things are a bit different if our island is infinitely big. Then you can push a bucket and it will keep going in that direction forever. In fact, the definition of period would need to be a bit different in infinite systems, but infinite islands aren't possible inside this game, so let's just assume that our islands are finite, the opposite of infinite. Okay, so getting back to interlacing, that's the exciting part. Both of these buckets have a period of 6, so they interlace nicely. What else can we do? Well, we can interlace more complicated systems together. So it kind of looks like these rings can pass through each other. And you can see that one of the rings is on light squares, and one of the rings is on dark squares, so they have the opposite polarity. And that means they can pass through each other. It looks weird, but it works. And visually, it looks like the buckets fit through the gaps between the other buckets, if that makes sense. But we can go one step further. We can even create interlacing systems where buckets are moving from 4 different directions, just so long as the polarity is still correct. So here's a crazy example. All of the buckets on the left have a plus sign towards the centre, as do all of the buckets on the right. All the buckets on the top have a minus sign towards the centre, which means they won't collide with any of the plus signs. And it's the same with the buckets on the bottom. And it might look like the plus signs will collide with each other, but they're in different lanes, remember. And just look at that! Is that not the coolest thing you've ever seen? The buckets perfectly interlace with each other and there are no collisions in the middle. Now, I mentioned earlier that buckets can pick up beans, and we can use our magic wand to make a bucket drop the bean it's carrying. But if the paths of 2 buckets overlap, then we can have one bucket drop the bean at the intersection and have it be picked up by a different bucket. We can keep doing this to transport a bean around different terrain. And remember, we can do this from afar as well with our wand, so we don't even need to be able to access the buckets. For example, take this level by Nico. We need to transport the red bean over each of the red bean detectors to open the doors. But we'll need to do it remotely. However, buckets can't move diagonally, so how are we going to get the bean to go over all of them? Well, we could use interlacing, just overlap the paths of the buckets. But we're mostly surrounded by water and all our buckets will just drown. Can you guess the solution? Well, in order to make a stable system, we need to set up bucket squares, just like we did in Bounce House earlier. And when we do that for each interlacing bucket pattern we need, we end up with a series of interlacing bucket squares. Together, these things are able to transport a red bean diagonally by being remotely activated at the right time. Very clever. And you might be wondering why I decided to call this system interlacing, but I'm calling this a bucket square rather than a bounce house. But I'm afraid that's just the way it is. So interlacing is pretty cool, but let's rewind for a second to take another look at these interlacing rings. Because you might have noticed how it's pretty cool that the rings bounce off the walls and still keep their structure. In particular, notice how the middle row seems to stay together with the other rows, even though it's a more complicated collision. There's actually a surprisingly simple explanation for this, but first let's have a look at some new structures. This is called a bucket chain. When it's in motion, all the buckets are separated by a gap and moving in the same direction, so they all have the same polarity. And when it reaches a wall, the chain compresses, so that now the buckets alternate direction along the chain. But they're still the same polarity as each other. It then decompresses again and starts moving in the other direction. And it's probably worth giving you a reminder about polarity. Basically, if 2 buckets are on the same coloured tile and facing in the same direction, then they're the same polarity. Or they might be on opposite colour tiles but facing in opposite directions, in which case they're still the same polarity. It looks slightly weird when they're decompressing from a wall, but you could interpret it as shockwaves being sent backwards through the chain. Each time a shockwave reaches the back of the chain, a bucket turns around and walks the other way, until every bucket has turned around. So what can we do with chains? Well, all the buckets are the same polarity, so they can pass through a polarity gate in one direction, I guess. And it also means they're pretty easy to interlace with each other. I like this a lot. And here's a more compact example. You can just about see there are 4 chains coming from each direction, interlacing with each other. And then there are also 4 buckets on the sides to keep the whole thing the same shape. In fact, I actually made this by accident when I was looking for shifting patterns earlier. It turns out that this cross pattern doesn't work like the others. It's also possible that a chain might not fully decompress from one wall before it starts compressing on the other wall. Hopefully you can tell what I mean from this example. And if a chain is fully compressed, then it acts as a wall and you can't get through it. Now let's try to do the same thing again, but this time with buckets of alternating polarity. We can compress them as far as they'll go against a wall and see what happens. And it kind of looks like it moves in the same way as the chains we saw earlier. This time there are 2 empty tiles between moving buckets, and 1 empty tile between buckets when they're compressed. So we might call this a chain, because it looks very similar. To distinguish them, I'm going to call this one a simple chain, because all the buckets have the same polarity, and this one an anti-chain, because it sounds cool. But an anti-chain is still a type of chain, because it moves like a chain. So here's an example of a bucket square where each side is a compressed anti-chain, and inside the bucket square are 2 interlacing simple chains. I hope you're still with me. In fact, you can take any row of buckets and compress them against a wall as far as they'll go, and if you release it, then it will start moving like a simple chain. And that's kind of interesting. All of these chains have a simple version of themselves. You might ask, does every row of buckets have a simple version of it? And the answer is yes, but let's first have a closer look at how chains interact with each other. This is going to seem complicated now, but we'll see a much easier way to look at it later on. So, our new definition of a chain is just anything that moves like a chain. Each part of the chain might be a single bucket or a group of buckets, and the gaps between moving buckets can either be 1 tile or 2 tiles. If the gap is between buckets that are the same polarity, we'll call it a simple gap, and if they're the opposite polarity, we'll call it a polarized gap. So what happens when 2 chains collide? The first thing to notice is that if they have the same number of parts, then they just bounce off each other. The first bucket in each chain sends shockwaves backwards through the chain, and each one causes one part of the chain to turn around at the back. This happens at the same rate, so they both just reverse. But what happens if one chain has more parts than the other chain? So here we have a 5-part chain colliding with a 2-part chain. The chains send shockwaves backwards until 2 parts have come off the 5 chain and the entire 2 chain has reversed. But now there's nothing stopping the rest of this chain from continuing, so they keep moving forwards. So, to summarise, we started off with a 5 chain colliding with a 2 chain, and ended up with a 2 chain and a 5 chain. The number of parts in each chain has swapped. I'm going to call this the Newton's Cradle effect, because if one bucket collides with 4 stationary buckets, then one bucket comes out the other side. They collide again, and one bucket comes out the other side, like a Newton's Cradle. Or if 2 buckets collide into it, then eventually 2 buckets come out the other side. So this is great, but it's all very confusing. We have to remember that our chains are made up of parts, and each part could be a single bucket or a group, and the gaps could be simple or polarized. So now let's look at a way to simplify all of this to make it a lot easier to understand. The main motivation here is that when all the buckets have the same polarity as each other, everything becomes a lot more simple. And in particular, we're only going to be talking about moving buckets that are all on the same row. So we might call this a one-dimensional system. If we also have buckets moving up and down, then it would be a two-dimensional system. So let's suppose we have a one-dimensional system, and let's look at pairs of buckets that have the opposite polarity to each other, with no other buckets in between. We'll call these polarized pairs. And the important thing to notice is that these polarized pairs come in 2 types. The first type is 2 buckets that are part of the same group. But remember, buckets in a group basically just act as one long bucket, so we can simplify this by just replacing it with 1 bucket. We're effectively deleting all the other buckets in the group, and all their tiles, so the whole row gets shorter. But that's fine, because the simplified system moves in basically the same way as the original system, just without so many buckets to deal with. We've got rid of some polarized pairs. The second type of polarized pair is 2 buckets with a polarized gap between them. But remember, if 2 buckets are polarized, then they'll always have an air collision, which means there's always at least 1 empty tile between them. So to simplify things, let's just choose an empty tile between them and delete it. And similar to before, this makes the whole row one tile shorter. But it doesn't really change how the buckets collide. That extra air tile we had before was unnecessary. And now the two buckets have the same polarity as each other. So by repeatedly simplifying groups and simplifying polarized gaps, we can turn any one-dimensional system into a system where all the buckets have the same polarity, and where it still seems to move in the same way. I'm going to call this simplifying, and a system where all the buckets have the same polarity will be called a simple system. So, any chain in a simple system is a simple chain. In fact, we can now define a chain to be anything that becomes a simple chain when simplified. And the important thing is that a simplified system moves in basically the same way as the original system. So if we can work with simple systems, we can always just add the polarizations back in later on. In fact, we can add whichever polarizations we want, so either making groups or polarized gaps. And every system moves in basically the same way as the original simple system. That's cool. But at first glance, it still looks hard to work out where one bucket is going to go, even in a so-called simple system. It all depends on the movement of the other buckets. So here's the big idea, and if you're familiar with other collisions and reflections, you might have seen this type of idea before. But let's say we're working with a simple system so all the buckets have the same polarity as each other, and two buckets collide. Well, they're the same polarity, so it's going to be a head-on collision. Just beforehand, they face towards each other, and just afterwards, they face away from each other. But doesn't it almost look as if they just walked through each other? Instead of looking at each physical bucket, let's pretend the buckets can walk through each other, so we're now following a kind of virtual bucket as it moves along. But if it can walk through every other bucket, then the only thing it will bounce off are the walls. So what's the period of this virtual bucket? How long will it take before it gets back to where it started? The answer is simply twice the row length. It needs to walk the entire row and back again to end up where it started. But this logic works for every bucket. So if you wait for a number of turns equal to twice the row length, then the entire bucket system will look identical to how it started. So for example, here the row length is 7, and if we wait for 14 turns, then the system returns back to how it started. Each virtual bucket has walked the entire row length forwards and backwards. I'm going to refer to this effect where it looks like two buckets can walk through each other as the transparency effect. It's really obvious when you look for it. Just pick a bucket and watch as it walks through every other bucket. Or pick a chain and watch as it walks through every other chain. In fact, the transparency effect gives us a much cleaner explanation of the Newton's Cradle effect. Instead of talking about shockwaves, it's now obvious that the chains appear to swap places because they effectively just walk through each other. How easy is that? And obviously, our virtual buckets can't carry beans, but we can still use the transparency effect to work out what the overall pattern of buckets will look like. And we'll talk about transporting beans a bit later on. We have now reached a point in the video when things are going to start getting abstract. I know we've been talking about one-dimensional systems for a while now, which aren't the most exciting, but I want to introduce some really useful notation before we go back to looking at cool two-dimensional systems again. Let's have another look at a simple system. Each virtual bucket bounces between two walls and passes through the other buckets. Now you could represent this movement on a circle. So when a bucket is travelling to the right, it goes along the top edge of the circle, and when it's travelling to the left, it goes along the bottom. And we can do the same thing even if we have multiple moving buckets. I'm going to call this a cycle diagram, and we can make one for any simple system. So, for example, what will this system look like after 7 turns? Well, the cycle diagram has 14 squares in it, so 7 turns is just rotating the cycle diagram by 180 degrees. Each bucket is now on the opposite side from where it started, and it's now swapped from going right to going left, which has the effect of mirroring the whole system. That's a bit of a weird thing to notice, but in general, if you wait for an amount of turns equal to 1 row length, the cycle diagram rotates 180 degrees, so the system will become the mirror image of how it started. Actually, a cycle diagram can tell us a lot about the period of a system. If it has no rotational symmetry, then it will need to rotate the full 360 degrees before the system looks like how it started. But if it does have rotational symmetry, then the system will look exactly the same after a smaller number of turns. So for example, this cycle diagram will look the same after 4 rotations, so the period of the original system is 4. But it's a bit annoying having to draw out a circle every time, so instead let's represent a system with ones and zeros. So this is 1, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1. And then a bunch of zeros at the end to represent the empty spaces. Each one represents a bucket, each zero represents a space. And to be clear, this isn't actually a number, it's more like a word. And with my labelling system, I'm always going to start at the front and work backwards. Or you could label using a cycle diagram by starting anywhere and going anti-clockwise. That might seem a bit weird, but I think it's the best way round for later on. You also might notice that because these buckets are all the same polarity, there's always going to be gaps between them. So we can get rid of every other zero to get 1, 1, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 0. This is a cycle word. And just like our rotating cycle diagram, this cycle word kind of rotates. So we could shift the pattern of ones forwards and backwards, and it would represent the same system. In general, to get the cycle word of a system, you label the buckets going to the left first, then come back the other way labelling the buckets moving right. One way will only be labelling light squares, the other will be labelling the dark squares. And remember, it doesn't matter when you label the system, because you'll get different versions of the same cycle word. Maybe that seems a bit abstract, so let's look at some examples. If there are multiple ones next to each other in this cycle word, then it represents a chain. So 1, 1, 1, 1 is a 4 chain. And the total number of digits is the total length of the row. If we have two chains colliding, we'll get something like 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0. It's actually pretty easy to turn a cycle word into a system as well. You just need to space your buckets out in the pattern shown in the cycle words, then take the bucket at the end and put it at the beginning so you have something to push. That might sound complicated, but trust me, if you tried doing it yourself, you'd work out what I meant. Also, it's still easy to check for rotational symmetry with cycle words. It just means that the word has a repeating pattern. So this cycle diagram has rotational symmetry order 2, and the cycle word is 110, 110. It repeats. And all the different versions of the cycle word also repeats. And you might notice that, interestingly, the system looks like it's split into two different subsystems, each of which has cycle word 110. Is this always true? In fact, let's ask a nicer question. When can a simple system transport a bean from one side to the other? We can't just look at virtual buckets anymore, we'll have to look at the physical buckets themselves. Let's say the bean starts off on the left. We want to get it to the right, and we can only shoot the system with our magic wand from a distance. Well, all we need to do is to make sure that for each edge between tiles, there's at least one bucket that can carry the bean over that edge to the next tile. Then we can pass the bean to the next bucket along, and keep going. The only problem we might have is if there's an edge where no bucket ever crosses it. Let's say we have exactly one of these for the moment. Then the buckets on either side of the edge always collide with each other. And this can only happen if they have mirrored movements. You might want to check that for yourself. Similarly, the next buckets on either side will also be mirrored, etc. until we get to a wall. It's a similar thing to earlier when the buckets kept colliding at the corner of the bucket square due to symmetry. But what does this have to do with rotational symmetry? Well, if we turn this into a cycle diagram, then you can see that the mirrored parts move to opposite sides of the circle, because they're facing different ways. That means the cycle diagram has rotational symmetry, and so the cycle word repeats itself. It's a similar thing if there's more rotational symmetry. We can split the system up into more pieces, each of which has the same cycle word. Although, confusingly, it alternates between mirrored versions and normal versions. And as a reminder, any system will turn into its mirror image after a certain number of turns, so a mirror image has the same cycle word as the original system. So, in other words, simple systems that can transport a bean from one side to the other are exactly those which have cycle words that don't have repeating patterns. And every cycle word that doesn't have a repeating pattern gives us a system that can transport a bean. I think that's pretty cool. But there's one more question I want to ask. We've looked at what happens when you mirror a system. It gives you the same cycle word. But what happens if you mirror the cycle word? So, for example, 11010 mirrored is 01011. But that's just a different version of the same word. Actually, the smallest cycle word that gives a different word when mirrored is 110100, which becomes 001011 or 101100. If you compare a 110100 system with a 101100 system, you'll see that, well, they're different. It's hard to spot a pattern. But actually, they'll both look the same as each other if you play one of them in reverse. What? Well, that should make sense. Mirroring a cycle word is the same as mirroring the cycle diagram. But then, all the buckets that were moving left are now moving right, and vice versa. So it will still look the same if you just make each bucket move backwards. But hang on a second. Can we always just move the buckets backwards to work out what came previously? It feels like it would work. And that would be a really easy way to undo something. And it does work in one-dimensional systems, but it doesn't work in two-dimensional systems. So look at this example. All four of these systems look the same. But if I go back one turn, they all were different beforehand. So we can't tell just by looking at the system what happened previously. But you might think, well, what if the system is stable and we know it's looping? Can we just move the buckets backwards to work out what it looked like previously? And, we'll need to bounce buckets off each other if necessary. It looks like it would work. But still no. This is a stable system, but if you tried to move the buckets backwards here, then you might think there was a three-way collision last turn. But there wasn't. So trying to move buckets backwards doesn't work in general. Although, it's obviously easy to work out what happened previously in a stable looping system, because you can just go forwards until you get to just before the bits you were at. And you can move buckets backwards to work out what came last in a one-dimensional system, so we're good on that front. So, where are we again? What were we talking about? Well, we've now looked a lot at one-dimensional simple systems, so ones where all the buckets are the same polarity. We will get back to two-dimensional systems very soon, but I just want to mention about how this applies to systems which aren't simple. So, for example, have a look at this system. If you simplify it, you'll get a 1010 system. The only difference is it has a polarized gap, and the buckets are now groups. So we could describe this system as a polarized 1010 system. And as a reminder, there are different ways you could polarize a simple system, so each gap between buckets could be polarized or not, and each bucket could be made into a group of however big you like. So when can a polarized system transport beans from one side to the other? Well, if you just turn some of the buckets into groups, then it's the same as the simplified system, because it's easy to transport beans along a group. If there are polarized gaps, then you need more of an overlap between the buckets in the simple system, and it gets a bit more complicated, so we're not going to go into it. Now, remember way back to when this video was fun and easy to understand. You may recall that we were looking at bucket squares, and I pointed out that you could make a bucket square with any side you wanted, as long as you make sure the whole thing is symmetrical around each corner. Well, we now have a few more tools to be able to look at it in a new way. So let's start with simple bucket squares, one where each side is a simple system, and the whole thing is shaped like a square. And it's made out of buckets. Then, just like earlier, you could try and follow the virtual buckets on each side, using the transparency effect again. And if you do that, you'll notice that the virtual buckets are always colliding with the same other virtual buckets at the corners. In fact, what we really have here are two overlapping virtual bucket squares. You can follow each of them as they follow the standard bucket square pattern. If we look at the cycle words, each side is 10100. But we might want to split that up, so we get one virtual bucket square which is 10000, and another which is 00100. That shows how they're offset from each other. So this is the new clever idea of overlapping different systems, and because of the transparency effect, they'll appear to just go through each other. So here's an example of two bucket squares which overlap on one side. We can label these again as 10000 and 00100, and so the middle side is 10100. And if you're confused what's going on, just try and follow each virtual bucket square with your eyes. It's the same standard pattern we've seen before, just overlapped. By the way, when we're comparing cycle words, I think it makes sense to give all of these four squares the same word, because they all sync up with their shared sides. So when we're comparing neatly tessellating squares, we compare the sides they have in common. Here's a bit of a more complicated example, this time with 4 overlapping squares. And if you look in the centre, it kind of looks like the collisions are rotating around. That's because I've synced up the squares so it goes round in a pattern. You can check the outside corners of the bucket squares to see the same collision pattern. We could label these something like 1000, 0100, 0010, 0001, so the collisions cycle round clockwise. And you could also look at the cycle words for each system and check that at least 2 buckets are colliding in every collision, but it's so much easier to just think of it as 4 overlapping bucket squares. But the squares don't need to overlap precisely either. So here's an example where 2 squares are overlapping in a weird way, and I've synced them up so they're mirror images of each other, so you end up with a symmetrical system. In fact, you could replace one half with a wall, and the other half would work fine. And here's what it looks like with 4 overlapping squares. Although you'll notice that each square overlaps with its neighbours, but interlaces with the square diagonally opposite. So we get these nice interlacing patterns between virtual buckets. Also, these are overlapped in such a way that the bottom 2 squares actually don't interact with the top 2 squares. That's also something you can do. But you can also overlap systems that aren't bucket squares. So for example, here's a setup where we have one bucket at the top, and we choose where and when we want this bucket to turn around in a looping pattern, and then we just push vertical buckets at the right time to make it work. And the period of the vertical buckets needs to be the same as the period of the top buckets. And then we can actually just add another bucket on the bottom doing the same thing as the top bucket, but a half period later, and it works by symmetry. Here's a similar thing, but 2 of the vertical buckets overlap with each other, but it works exactly the same as before. We could also overlap a system with itself. Here I've overlapped another one in exactly the same place, but 2 turns later, and it effectively turns each bucket into a simple chain. Or here's what one of these systems looks like if we overlap it symmetrically, although I've made use of the symmetry a bit. So, overlapping looks like a fun way to make fancy looking bucket systems, but there are some things you have to be careful of. The main thing is that 2 virtual buckets can't both occupy the same space, which sounds obvious, but it's easy to mess up. So for example, this bucket needs to move forwards, but this bucket wants to turn around in this collision. So they're both attempting to move into this tile at the same time. And the result is that this bucket gets turned around and sent off course. You can generally avoid this by making sure the systems you're overlapping have the same periods, or multiples of each other's periods. But you just need to be careful depending on what your system looks like. Also, if you're going to try this for yourself, I'd recommend designing your system as a simple system, and then you can always go in and polarize it later. Otherwise, the transparency effects might not work the way you think it should. But now I want to go back and have a much closer look at bucket squares. And you might think, haven't we already seen everything we can do with bucket squares already? And it turns out the answer is not even close. So to be clear, a bucket square is strictly square shapes, and each side has at least 1 bucket. This one is the most basic example. But we've seen that we can also make a bucket square by putting any system of buckets on one side, and then just making the whole thing symmetric. We've also seen that every simple bucket square, where each side is simple, can be thought of as just overlapping basic bucket squares. Once we have a simple bucket square, we can add 1 polarization to each side to increase the size of the square. But we can choose which polarization we want for each side. We could turn any of the buckets into a group, or we could add a polarized gap between 2 buckets, so we can make bucket squares that are no longer symmetric. And we could keep adding polarizations as much as you want. But that's still not a complete description of bucket squares. So far we've only seen squares where every side has the same cycle words. But that's not actually necessary. For example, this bucket square has sides with cycle word 101010. But notice that all we need for a side to fit in the bucket square is that the bucket on the far left collides at the right time, and the bucket on the far right does too. The middle isn't really important. So, when do the buckets collide with the corner? Let's call it the knock pattern, and it's actually entirely determined by the cycle word. But we could get the same knock pattern by just using a 1-0 system. This bucket collides with the left wall every time the top system does. And it also collides with the right wall every time the top system does. So we could substitute the top system with the bottom system. But that's not quite going to work if we want to keep everything looking like a square. Luckily, we can just polarize to increase its length. In this example, we'd need 4 polarizations to make them the same length. And of course, in general, we can choose which polarizations we want to use. I'm going to call this a polarized substitution. So here's another example. The top system is 110, 110, 110, and the bottom system is a polarized 110 system. They have the same repeating cycle pattern, 1-1-0, but the top one repeats it 3 times, whereas the bottom one repeats it once. And that means that the left buckets move in sync, and the right buckets move in sync. So I could substitute the top system with the bottom system. One more example. This time a 1-0-1-0-1-0-1-0 system can be substituted with a 1-0-1-0 system. The funny thing about substituting is that we can only take off 2 lots of the repeating pattern at a time. So we could substitute with 1-0-1-0, but not 1-0-1-0-1-0 or 1-0. That's because the 1-0 subsystems alternate between normal and mirrored variants, so we have to take off 2 at a time. It's a bit weird, but that's the way it is. So, to recap, we can make a simple bucket square by overlapping basic squares. Then we can substitute each side if we want, and then we can add or remove a certain number of polarizations from each side to change the size of the square. Is there anything we're missing? Unfortunately, yes. If we go back to this example, you'll notice that we could do something that looks a bit like a substitution because it keeps the same knock pattern on the left, but these ones make the knock pattern on the right be the opposite. What do I mean by that? Well, it's exactly halfway offset from the normal knock pattern. So if the normal knock pattern is 1-0, then the opposite knock pattern is 0-1. Or if the normal knock pattern is 1-1-1-0, then the opposite would be 1-0-1-1. It shifted the cycle pattern half its length. Or you can think of it as swapping the first half with the second half. And we're going to call this antiphasing. In order to create an antiphase, we need a cycle pattern that repeats at least twice. Then, if we take off the last repetition of the pattern and replace it with polarizations, we get an antiphase. And we're going to say that the normal knock pattern is what you get if there are no polarizations. So if we use an antiphase, you can think of it as switching the square into an antiphased version, which we might represent with a different colour. In order to get back to the normal phase, we'll need another antiphase side. So I think that hopefully, maybe, finishes our classification of bucket squares. And to be honest, any saner person would leave it at that. But we've talked so long about one-dimensional systems, and now we've talked a lot about two-dimensional systems, so why not go into 3 dimensions? Welcome to a brief excursion to my Minecraft world. I wish I could animate buckets moving in 3D properly, but this will have to do. What you're looking at right now is a representation of a 3-dimensional bucket cube. Each of these blocks represents a bucket, and each turn they either move forwards, or if they can't move forwards, they turn around. And you can see that each face of this bucket cube is a bucket square. And the collisions alternate between red corners and white corners. So this is our basic bucket cube. In general, a bucket cube is cube-shaped, so no buckets wandering in the middle of anything, and there's at least 1 bucket on each edge. So, and you knew this was coming, can we make it more complicated? Well, interestingly, with the bucket cube, each corner has buckets coming from 3 directions. But we only need 2 buckets to make each collision work. And at first glance, this seems like it's going to make things ridiculously complicated. But actually, it's basically the same things as we were doing to make 2D squares. So the first step is to look at building simple bucket cubes, where each edge is a simple system. And just like earlier, we can do this by overlapping basic bucket squares. So here we have 3 overlapping red squares in 3D, and they all have the same offset as each other. And then we have a yellow square with a different offset, and a blue square with a different offset again. And if we merged all of these squares together into a proper cube, we'd get a stable, simple bucket cube. Each colour represents a different offset, and our side length is 5, so we can potentially use up to 5 different colours. But we don't just have to use squares. Any bucket shape around the cube will be fine. So this red shape is like a folded bucket rectangle. This is actually the representation of the complicated bucket cube I showed earlier. The important thing is that there are no coloured lines that stick off on their own, because then the bucket would wander off. And when you see it like this, it's really not too bad. Every simple bucket cube can be built like this. Although, of course, you know, a red cube is going to be the same thing as a blue cube. They're offset from each other, but if I showed you one in isolation after it had been running for a while, you couldn't tell the difference. Then, just like before, once we have a simple bucket cube, we can polarize each side to make it bigger, or do some polarized substitutions. And that's not too bad. But of course, we also need to talk about antiphases. This is going to get, briefly, pretty complicated, and I might have got all this theory wrong anyway, but here we go. So, this is a representation of a bucket cube with one antiphase. You can see that red and blue turn into yellow and pink. This is 1010 antiphasing into 0101. The rest of the cube looks normal though, and you can see that each colour turns into a normal bucket square. It's just this edge that's weird. This representation turns into this bucket cube. Most of it looks normal, but this is what an antiphased 1010 system looks like. We've effectively turned it into one long 10 system. Working out what antiphases are available to you is a little complicated, but for a certain size of bucket cube, you can look at what repeating patterns you can make, and then work out what happens when you antiphase them. So, it's possible that this red line could turn into a yellow line, and then later on turn into a blue line. It can get really complicated. Here's one more example. This time we can take the repeating pattern 1-1 and antiphase it. But the cycle pattern 1 is odd length, so antiphasing it creates a pattern that's the opposite polarity to normal. A kind of polar pattern. So this is still representing that cube over there, but a bit bigger. And you can see that we're using antiphases which take red and blue to the polar colours pink and yellow. Each gap represents an antiphase. And that corresponds to a group in our bucket cube. And the rule is, you can't overlap polar colours with normal colours. If you think about it enough, that should make sense. So part of this cube is polar, and the other part is normal. Although, which one's polar and which one's normal depends on your perspective. The final thing I'll point out is that you can double the side length of this cube, and spread out all the buckets to basically create the same thing, but instead of 2 normal colours and 2 polar colours, we now just have 4 normal colours. We've basically stuck a 0 after each digit in every cycle word. In fact, this is the same antiphase we saw earlier. And I think all of this is justified, because for any bucket cube, you can take the lowest common multiple of the lengths of all the cycle words, then create a new bucket cube of that size, then antiphase if necessary, then substitute if necessary, and then add or remove polarizations, and you should be able to go back to your original bucket cube. But I haven't proved that, and it's probably wrong. So if you find an example that doesn't work, let me know. And of course, we couldn't end this discussion without briefly talking about bucket hypercubes. If you didn't know, a 4-dimensional hypercube is called a tesseract, and you can make it by joining 2 cubes together. Each diagonal line here should really be stretching into the 4th dimension, but sadly that's a little bit hard to represent. And you'll notice that if the other cube is coloured the opposite of the first cube, then each corner is only connected to corners of the opposite colour. And that lets us set up a basic bucket hypercube in any dimension. Just make the collisions alternate between red corners and white corners. Creating a 4D bucket hypercube is very similar to making a bucket cube, but there's an important difference. Because each corner has 4 edges coming out of it, we can make it out of 2 bucket shapes that don't share any sides in common. So this 4D hypercube is built out of a yellow loop and a purple loop. But these loops are completely independent from each other, so they can have different periods to each other, and they can even have the opposite polarity from each other, meaning we can build one of them out of a polar colour. So hypercubes, unsurprisingly, are even more crazy, but I think that's more than enough for this video. And now we have a good understanding of bucket theory, it's time to ask the big question. Can we build a computer out of buckets? The answer is, at least in theory, yes. So the first step in building a computer is to make wires. We need to be able to carry a signal from one place to another. And this signal is going to be in binary, so 1s and 0s. And the obvious thing to do is to send a bucket to represent a 1, and send nothing to represent a 0. But the obvious problem is that if we send one bucket, then it will just end up bouncing back and forth forever. We need a way to stop it again. We could put some water at the end, but then we'll eventually run out of buckets. Or we could use a polarity gate, but buckets can't change their polarity, so we'd never be able to get it out again. Instead, I'm going to use a slightly wider gate, which I'll call a binary gate. We'll make sure the bucket is the right polarity so it can get trapped by the gate, but we can also push it through to send a signal. The bucket then comes back and gets trapped by the gate again. So this is how we could send binary signals. And we can connect these together to form longer wires. The problem is that we have to wait a long time before we can send another bit of information, and it's hard to sync everything up. So here's the design I'm going to go with. It uses the transparency effect to send information more frequently. We start the signal at the left, and at the right we have a binary gate, so only ones are able to pass through. I'm going to call this a neuron, and it can only pass signals in one direction. The important thing is to always look at the binary gate to see if the buckets can make it through or not. If a bucket gets through, then it's a 1, if it doesn't, then it's a 0. If this looks complicated, it might make more sense if we substitute it with a group, but for a few reasons I'm mostly going to stick with simple neurons for now. So like before, we can connect multiple neurons end to end to pass a signal along. You can also split a signal off from a neuron by just starting a new neuron coming off it, and it will give a duplicate copy of the signal, so that's quite important. We can also connect two neurons to the start of an output neuron, and the output neuron fires if either of the original neurons fire. So this is effectively an OR gate. The output is a 1 if either of the inputs is a 1. We can also make a NOT gate, so we use an odds length neuron so it normally outputs 1s, and then we binary offset the buckets to turn them into 0s. This swaps all our 0s into 1s and vice versa. We can also create a NOT gate by reading an inverted signal from a neuron in a similar way. Whether the signal is inverted or not depends on where you read the signal. And it's a fun fact that any logic gate with however many inputs and outputs as you want can be made by combining OR gates and NOT gates. So here's an AND gate. You invert both the inputs, then you combine them in an OR gate, then you invert the outputs. Although, actually I've combined the last two steps into what's basically a NOR gate, which is an OR gate followed by a NOT. Also, I'm using buttons and doors here just because it's easier to input signals, but theoretically you'd be inputting from other bucket signals. In fact, buttons and doors already form their own logic system in the game, but we won't be using them. We can do everything just with buckets. However, there's one problem I've ignored so far, which is if I use a NOT gate, then it changes the phase of the signal, and that's really bad. To see what I mean, notice that ideally all our binary gates should be colliding at the same time. That means they're all in the same phase. And it doesn't matter if the gates' collisions are the opposite way round, because that's basically just antiphasing, which, as we covered earlier, we can still deal with easily. But if neurons have different phases other than normal or antiphases, then we can't connect them together. We could put two NOT gates next to each other to get back to the right phase, but two NOT gates cancel each other out. And I'm sure there's an easy solution to this, but my terrible idea is just to switch from using a 2-segment system, where buckets walk over 2 tiles, to using a 3-segment system, where everything's a little more spread out. A NOT gate still pushes our signal 1 turn out of phase, but now we can use 3 NOT gates to get back into the right phase, and 3 NOT gates basically acts as 1 NOT gate. This is, I'm sure, unnecessarily complicated, but it's the best I could do. I should also point out that we're now using wider gates, which technically could have 3 different phases of buckets going through them, providing we fix the polarity. But we're only ever using 2 of those phases, so it's still effectively a binary system. It works exactly the same as before. So how close are we to building a computer? Well, you may be aware that you can technically build a computer entirely out of NOT gates and OR gates if you really wanted, or even just out of NOR gates. But what does that mean? Well, for example, one way to create a clock would be to connect a NOT gate to itself. So it reads a 0 and outputs a 1, then reads a 1 and outputs a 0, in a loop. And that repeating signal can control other processes. With buckets, my example is a bit messy because it's technically 3 NOT gates connected together, but if you look at the output of one of the neurons, you'll see it outputs 6 1s, then 6 0s, then repeats. But obviously, this is completely unnecessary for a bucket computer, because you can create a clock by just having a bucket bounce back and forth between 2 walls, and you can control the speed of the clock by how far the bucket travels, and you can control what repeating signal you want by choosing the right cycle word. The other thing that's important to check is that you can connect any 2 logic gates together. So for us, that means our neurons need to be able to turn corners, and we've also already seen how we can create a copy of a signal as well. So all that's left is to make sure that our neurons can cross over each other. But luckily, switching to a 3-segment system means we can now do that without any interference. You can also create read-write memory out of just OR gates and NOT gates. So here's an example of what's known as an RS NOR latch. The bucket system remembers which side it received an input from last, either from the left or the right. It's a bit hard to tell what's going on, But remember, you can see what value it's storing by looking at whether or not the buckets can get through the binary gates. And you could read this value off by using branching neurons. This one has the downside that you need a 3-length pulse to update the value of the latch. In theory, you should be able to store information by just changing the phase of buckets with a 3-segment system, but it's hard to read off this information, so this example doesn't really work. There are other possibilities as well, and a lot of room for creativity, but my point is that you don't need to optimize if you don't want to. You could build complex systems with everything I've shown so far. It would just be very large and very slow. If you are interested in building bigger contraptions, then you might want to have a look at how people have built computers in Minecraft and the Game of Life. The specific details vary, but the overall idea is similar. And just in case you do want to go with a 3-segment system like this, I should point out that the standard NOT gate gives +1 phase, but the other type of NOT gate gives -1 phase. That confused me for a while. And you'll need to get the phase right if you want to cross neurons over each other or loop a signal back around to itself. And you can build a phase converter to change the phase of a signal by combining 2 of the same type of NOT gates. But honestly, there's probably much better ways of doing all of this, so you can probably ignore all of that anyway. So, in theory, it's possible to create a computer system just out of moving buckets. And if you hadn't realised yet, you don't technically even need walls. You can replace them all with minimal bucket squares. I mean, you might need to spread everything out a bit more and add some loop extensions, but in theory I think it should work. So given enough space and enough buckets, you could create a program to calculate whatever you wanted. It would just take forever to build and take a really long time to run. You could even theoretically simulate a bucket system inside a bucket system. But let's be honest, it's never going to look as cool as it does with the Game of Life. So at this point, if you hadn't realised it way earlier, you might have realised now that you've been duped into watching a maths video. In fact, this game was made by a group of people who met at a maths PhD programme, and the game itself is about a group of academics studying these systems, and it's full of little pieces of academic writing, although most of it seems to be more scientific than mathematical. So let's briefly have a look at some maths. For example, the cycle diagrams we looked at might be called a binary necklace, and if you look up the Wikipedia page for necklace combinatorics, you can find a formula that some historical nerd has worked out, which counts the number of one-dimensional simple bucket systems in a given space. Sure, why not? Or you might find out that non-repeating cycle words are called Linsen words, and someone clever has found an algorithm that generates all of them quickly. So if you want to set up every possible one-dimensional simple bucket system that can transport a bean from one side to the other, there you go. And there's even apparently a formula to count how many transport systems you can make, known as Moreau's necklace counting function, which makes use of a Mobius function mu, so hey, if you really want to calculate how many ways there are to do it, then now you can. And you might notice that the first few values are 2, 1, 2, 3, 6, 9, 18, 30, 56, etc. But why is the first number 2? Well, this also applies to transport systems. If your row length is 1, and you want to get a bean from one side to the other, then guess what, you've already done it. So technically there are 2 options here. You either don't have a bucket, or you do have a bucket, it doesn't matter. Whereas if your row length is 2, then you'll need exactly 1 bucket to take the bean from one side to the other. And would you believe it, these numbers also apparently count the number of a certain type of polynomial, because everything in maths is polynomials. And you might be wondering, how come there are so many maths nerds in the world that any possible thing you can think of probably has some formula out there somewhere if you know where to look? Who even are the people coming up with these things? And the answer, interestingly, is that Moreau's necklace counting formula was introduced by a French soldier called Colonel Moreau. Now, Colonel Moreau is noteworthy for 2 reasons. The first is that he came up with a horrible function that happens to count the number of simple bucket systems that can transport a bean from one side to the other. And the second is that he holds the world record for losing the most number of games in an international chess tournament without winning a single game. He lost all 26 of his games at Monte Carlo in 1903. It was so bad that reportedly he also broke records afterwards for the number of gifts he received, including hens and quail's eggs, potatoes, tomatoes, apples and beads. Basically anything shaped roughly like a 0, and each gift contained exactly 26 things. And that's the only interesting thing about him. Other than that, no one's ever heard of him. But you'll notice that I'm not doing any of the hard maths here. I'm just searching for the right things online and using results from Wikipedia. The fun part, I'd argue, is working out how to interpret these systems in the first place. So to end this video, I'm going to show you one last example of a clever way to look at bucket systems. And just by changing our perspective, we'll be able to avoid doing any actual maths entirely. So earlier we were looking at interlacing systems, and we saw that if we make sure the buckets have the same period as each other, and as they're approaching each other they have the opposite polarity, then we can get interlacing to work pretty easily. But what about if I just show you two buckets in a room, one of them vertical and one of them horizontal, and I want to know, are they going to collide? If so, are they always going to collide from the same direction, or might they collide from different directions? Is there an easy way to work out what the period of this system is? And come on, we've looked at overlapping systems and how to antiphase and four-dimensional hypercubes. Surely two buckets bouncing back and forth can't be that difficult. But actually, depending on where the bucket starts in this room, you could make a system where the buckets only collide from one direction, or collide from two different directions, or never collide. And the period of the system could be any even number between 2 and 24, or 46. How can we possibly make sense of this? And sure, you could sit down and do some horrible algebra and come up with some calculations. But I want to suggest a different way of looking at it. If you think about it for long enough, you might have realised that we kind of have one bucket giving us a horizontal position, and one bucket giving us a vertical position. So together, they make a diagonally moving bouncing object. Oh, I don't know, let's call it a DVD logo, like one of those DVD screensavers where you're waiting for it to bounce perfectly in the corner. Although, it doesn't bounce perfectly in this example, so instead let's say that the logo follows the front face of each bucket. That way it moves along the corners of the grid and it bounces nicer. So if the DVD logo hits a corner, that's the same as both buckets bouncing off a wall at the same time. Interesting. But of course, if both buckets collide, then the DVD logo bounces and changes direction. We can make sense of this by just shading the tile where the two buckets' paths cross each other. Each time the DVD logo hits this intersection, it turns around. If the two buckets collide near a wall, then we can get a different type of collision, but it's still basically the same thing. We can still just shade the intersection and the DVD logo looks like it bounces off it. One thing to notice is that the DVD logo itself has polarity. In fact, it's literally just moving diagonally, so it's the same thing as the bishops earlier. Either it's stuck on red corners, or it's stuck on white corners. And that means that for every tile, it can at most enter the tile from two directions. So for example, with the intersection, it can only collide with it on at most two of its corners. In fact, we already saw this when we looked at directional polarity. The buckets can only ever collide in at most two possible ways. The next thing to do then is to look at what path the DVD logo takes. But is this problem really any simpler? Isn't this still going to be really hard to calculate? Well, there's a reason that I've been calling it a DVD logo, and that's because there's a YouTube video by Another Roof that goes over all the maths of DVD logos. So we don't have to do anything. We can basically just copy his results and modify them a bit to make them work. And obviously, if you want a more in-depth explanation, you can go and watch that video. So there are 4 different things that can happen. We need to know whether the DVD logo will hit the intersection or not, and whether it hits a corner or not. If it doesn't hit the intersection, then the buckets will never collide. So it's an interlacing system. And the DVD logo will bounce in exactly the same way as in the Another Roof video, so we can copy his results for the period. If we say x is the width of our area and y is the height, then the period is just twice the lowest common multiple of x and y. So in this example it's double 12, so 24. And it turns out that it's the same whether or not it hits a corner. Again, you can go and watch the other video if you want an explanation. Then let's look at what happens if it hits both the intersection and a corner. The path will go between 2 corners, but somewhere along the path it's interrupted by the intersection. And we can place the intersection anywhere from really close to the corner, or right the way on the other side. And this means the new period of the DVD logo could be anywhere between 2 and twice the LCM minus 2. The buckets will then alternate between a collision at the intersection and a simultaneous wall collision when the DVD logo reaches the corner. And finally, what happens when the DVD logo hits the intersection but doesn't hit the corners? Then its path is a loop of length twice the LCM, but with the intersection placed somewhere along it. So it travels twice the LCM minus 1 to go around one way, and then it turns around and goes twice the LCM minus 1 steps back again. So In total, the period is 4 times the LCM minus 2. And the buckets will collide from one direction with the intersection, and then later on collide from the other direction, and then repeat. And there you go. Even if you don't care that much about exactly how long each period is, it's pretty cool that we can understand 2 buckets bouncing just in terms of a DVD logo. And I just want to briefly mention a couple of special cases. If X and Y are coprime, which means they don't share any common factors, then every DVD logo path will hit both the corner and the intersection. It always hits the corner because of another roof's explanation, and it always hits the intersection because the path length will be equal to the LCM, and there are only LCM many tiles total, so it goes through every tile. So we always get this case. In fact, being coprime is the same as saying that the HCF, or highest common factor, is 1. The next smallest the HCF could be is of course 2, and in this case we can get a path that never enters the corners, but it will be of length twice the LCM, so it enters every tile again, which means that the bottom right option isn't possible. When the HCF is at least 3, you can get all 4 possible options. And if none of that made any sense, then either go watch the Another Roof video, or just enjoy the bouncing DVD logo and move on with your life. And so finally, we've come to the end of what I have to say about bucket systems. And I mean, we've seen a lot, but there's so much more to ask about. Like, is there an easier way to understand 2-dimensional systems with more than 2 buckets? You could try extending the buckets into mirror world extensions, but I don't know if that makes things simpler. So for example, with this system, you could extend it into a bucket square by pretending the walls are mirrors that the buckets can pass through, if that makes any sense at all. Or if you look at our DVD logo system, you could also categorize the patterns based on what the mirror world extensions are. So this one becomes a bucket square, these ones are just an infinite interlacing row and column, and this one is an infinite bucket staircase, something that looks like this but repeated infinitely. But does any of this really illuminate anything? I don't know. You could probably do a similar thing with most systems inside walled rectangles, and kind of with systems inside other walls as well, but I haven't really looked into it. Or how about looking at when every bucket in a system turns around at the same time? Let's call it a reflection. Well, is it true that every stable system has either 0 reflections or 2 distinct reflections? If it is true, is it obvious? And it seems obvious that there's either 0 or 2, but like we saw earlier, a system after a reflection doesn't necessarily do the same thing but backwards. And anyway, is it easy to tell in general if a given system has a reflection or not? I don't know. If you want to look into it yourself, you can get the game. It's called Being and Nothingness. But that's as far as I'm taking this video. Or if you like this type of stuff, then you can watch Another Roof's video, and if you've never seen 3 Blue 1 Brown series about colliding boxes, then that's definitely also worth a watch. I'll be honest, I originally started this project as just writing a document about bucket polarity. But I kept adding in more and more examples, and the project kept getting bigger and bigger, and this is where we are now. If I knew how long this video was going to be when I started, I would have actually coded a bucket simulation rather than pushing buckets around the whole time, and I'm sure that would have made things a lot easier, but I didn't. Do you know what the story in this game is about? I said it was about 4 academics studying the different monsters, but that doesn't fully describe it. It's about academia. A cast of characters from different backgrounds, all trying to devote their lives to progressing the niche field of bean studies. The documents go into a lot of detail about how they got into bean studies, balancing work and family life, applying for funding, trying to publish papers, experimenting, inventing new things, and turning silly ideas into reality just to see what happens. Is bean studies relevant to literally anything outside of their work? Probably not. It's probably completely useless. I mean, at one point, they work out that the teleporters take them to a different world, with possibly infinite resources, but none of the characters even seem remotely interested in the possibility of expanding humanity into these new worlds, or trying to find a way to export resources back to Earth, or even if they're in the same universe. This other world only exists as a place to escape. A place where they can build a home, make puzzles and study buckets all day without having to worry about money and jobs and politics. It's a fantasy, both for the academics within the game, and for the academics that created it. In reality, the group of developers behind the game struggled to finish it. It was started back in 2012, but it took them 9 years to get it done, with work often completely stopping when their full-time jobs got in the way. It's a miracle the game even exists. You can't live in the world of being and nothingness. And I can't pretend like this video will help you with anything. Buckets are, at the end of the day, just a small part of a game you might never play. They're not a fundamental part of the universe or anything like that, and after this video ends, you might never think about them again. But I hope you've had fun watching them bounce around for a while. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.